Andrew Jackson was born on the 15th of March 1767. So he was about the same age as John Quincy Adams, or just about 3 months older actually. Later in life, they both fought for the presidency in 1824, and although Jackson was by far the more popular candidate, Adams won the presidency through a deal with Henry Clay, who became Secretary of State. Jackson's ancestors were Scottish and Irish. His father had come from Carriganfergus in County Antrim in Ireland. He was killed in a logging incident about a month before Andrew was born. As a family, they settled in the South Carolina region. In 1780, the Waxhaws Massacre occurred in South Carolina. It was a brutal massacre where 113 US militiamen lost their lives in a brutal British Army attack. Young Jackson, at the age of 13, was deeply influenced by this event. There was some misunderstanding whereby the British Army captain was shot after the US militia had agreed to surrender. After that, all hell broke loose. Jackson joined the local militia and developed a strong anti-British attitude which remained with him throughout his life. He was captured by the British at about the age of 14 and suffered serious injury when he refused to clean the boots of British soldiers. As a young teenager, he lost his brother and his mother through injury and sickness caused by the Revolutionary War. Despite these enormous obstacles and family tragedies, however, Jackson began to study law as a teenager and was called to the North Carolina bar at the age of 20. Once he qualified as a lawyer, he moved to Nashville, Tennessee. Here he met and married Rachel Donaldson Roberts in 1790. Tennessee was not yet a state back then in 1790, so Jackson was one of the few qualified lawyers in the territory, and as a result, he became the Atorney General of Tennessee at the age of 24. He helped white settlers lay legal claims to land. He bought land in his own right and became one of the original investors in a newly emerging town at that time called Memphis in Tennessee. When Tennessee became a state in 1796, Jackson became its first representative in Congress at the age of 29. 3 years later, he became a Tennessee Supreme Court judge. After a couple of years as a judge, however, he got somewhat bored and he resigned his position and joined the Tennessee militia again and became their commander. In 1804, Jackson bought an estate of 650 acres and constructed his famous mansion known as the Hermitage. By 1820, he had expanded this estate to over 1,000 acres and had over 100 enslaved people working on his estate. Like Aaron Burr, Jackson killed a man in a duel, so they were both somewhat outsiders, political outcasts for a period. But Jackson, after long discussions with Burr, parted ways with him when he realized that Burr's plan was basically to set up an independent state in South Florida, or the Florida region generally. As the 1812 war progressed, Jackson and his Tennessee militia became involved in the war. Part of the British strategy was to encourage Native Americans to revolt against the authority of the federal government. In March 1814, Jackson's militiamen attacked Native Americans at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Over 800 Creek warriors were killed to 47 US militiamen. In August 1814, at the Treaty of Fort Jackson, the Creek Nation were forced to surrender 23 million acres of land to the United States government. From this time onwards, Jackson was seen as a controversial figure. For some, he was a white settler's hero, but for others he was seen as a tyrant who trampled on the rights of Native Americans. By late 1814, Jackson learned of British intentions to attack the city of New Orleans. This city, which is built at the mouth of the Mississippi, was of great commercial and strategic importance. He arrived at New Orleans with his militia on the 1st of December 1814, well before the British. He set up strong fortifications, recruiting both Native Americans and Spanish volunteers. Although he was outnumbered 2-1, he achieved a brilliant victory, killing over 290 British soldiers to 13 US militiamen. The battle fought on the 8th of January was totally unnecessary as the Treaty of Ghent had been signed 2 weeks earlier. Communications were slow at that time, so that news of the war and news of the victory at New Orleans became known in America at the same time. Jackson was seen to have won the war and thereby became a national hero. Between 1816 and 19, General Jackson was involved in several clashes with Native Americans in the Florida region. These clashes and minor battles are generally known as the First Seminole War. Neither Britain nor Spain were able to control their American territories. Eventually, Spain recognized this situation and signed the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819, ceding Florida to the United States. A further treaty in 1823 left a large reservation in central Florida to the Native American people. Unfortunately, clashes between white settlers and Native Americans continued to occur, and the Indian Removal Act of 1830 recognized this situation and legalized the removal of Native Americans from Florida. By the early 1820s, Andrew Jackson was a national figure, and in July 1822, the Tennessee legislature nominated him to run for president. In the November 1824 election, he was the most popular candidate, winning 99 electoral college votes to Quincy Adams's 84. However, a deal was done between John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay, the second and fourth place candidates, and this ensured that Jackson was denied the presidency. Jackson called the deal a corrupt deal. He refused to take a cabinet position and announced his intention basically to run for the presidency again in 1828. Over the next few years, that's the late 20s, Jackson led the Democratic Party as a separate entity in Congress. He made anti-corruption one of his main platforms. He was basically in favor of a moderate tariff. He opposed also the rechartering of the National Bank and developed various other populist platforms whereby political power would be taken from the elites and transferred to the ordinary citizens of the United States. He won the 1828 presidential election, beating Adams 642,000 votes to 500,000. This represented the development of a two-party system for the first time in a new and energetic way. As president, he brought about the rotation of government offices. He sacked a lot of long-term government officials and gave their jobs to his own supporters. This became known as the spoil system and was criticized frequently because in many ways it represented inefficiency with people who weren't experienced to run high office. Early on in his presidency, a scandal broke out in Washington known as the Petticoat Affair. This event involved the vice president's wife, Mrs. John Calhoun, who considered Peggy Eaton, the wife of Secretary of War John Eaton, to be unsuitable to socialize in high-class Washington circles because of her background. This event caused immense political division and conflict within the various cabinets and Congress as people took sides on the issue. Jackson was pressurized by many to sack his Secretary of War. However, he disliked being told what to do and decided to stand by the Secretary. Eventually, the crisis was resolved when Secretary of State Martin Van Buren offered his resignation as Secretary of State and asked other members of the cabinet to do likewise. Jackson nominated Van Buren as ambassador to Britain, but this was blocked by the casting vote of John Calhoun, who was vice president, therefore had the casting vote in the Senate. The vice president, John Calhoun, was also in conflict with the president in regard to the level of the tariff. Southern cotton interests feared the impact of a high tariff could have on the export trade of cotton. A high United States tariff could cause other countries to impose a similar tariff on American exports. Such a scenario could ruin the Southern economy. Calhoun from South Carolina was therefore strongly opposed to a high tariff. In fact, Calhoun wrote an essay defending South Carolina's right to annul the tariff. Jackson strongly disagreed, claiming that the effective powers of the federal government depended on its ability to raise money. So in November 1832, the South Carolina legislature declared the tariff nullified, and this created something of a crisis known as the nullification crisis. John Calhoun resigned as vice president and began to represent South Carolina as a senator. Jackson reacted by declaring that any state nullifying the law of the federal government would be acting in a manner incompatible with the existence of the Union. Later, he followed this up by asking Congress to pass a force bill which would empower the federal government to enforce the tariff by military means, if necessary, on any state. In response, Henry Clay and John Calhoun devised a declining tariff known as the Compromise Tariff of 1832, and the crisis was averted for the present. In relation to the Native Americans, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 allowed the President to draw up treaties with Native Americans. Jackson's administration drew up several such treaties. There were, of course, dissenting voices within the tribes. Thousands objected to being pushed off their traditional lands and moved westwards. Neither military security nor medical supplies were supplied as promised. Thousands lost their lives in this so-called event known as the Trail of Tears. These events seriously damaged Jackson's place in American history. The position of the National Bank was the dominant issue of the 1832 election. Jackson was opposed to rechartering the bank unless there were substantial reforms to root out corruption. Jackson believed the bank was unconstitutional and gave too much power to capitalists. In January 1832, the president of the bank, Nicholas Niddle, submitted to Congress a bill for the renewal of the bank's charter without any of the proposed reforms. In June and July, the bill passed both the Senate and the House of Representatives. However, on the 10th of July 1832, Jackson vetoed the bill. Jackson's veto attacked the bank as an agent of corruption and inequality, and primarily a supporter of the wealthy elite. The bank issue dominated the 1832 election. Henry Clay was Jackson's main opponent, running for the National Republicans. Jackson, however, won the election in a landslide victory of 219 votes to 49 electoral college votes. Following the election, Jackson ordered the removal of bank deposits from the major banks in the Northeast to the southern states, thereby increasing speculation and inflation. The big banks on the East Coast responded by tightening credit and causing interest rates to rise. Jackson blamed the banks for any of the economic problems that were caused as a result. This was known as the Panic of 1837. By January 1835, the national debt was reduced to zero. This was a huge achievement at the time, mainly achieved by the selling of land. This was achieved largely because of the westward expansion as well. To counteract inflation caused by the purchase of land, Jackson introduced a policy known as specie circular. And what happened here was that land could only be bought for either gold or silver. It couldn't be bought for paper money, basically. In 1835 also, there was a strong anti-slavery movement beginning to develop, and it was beginning to develop both in Congress and among the people. John Quincy Adams was the primary spokesman in Congress. Northern abolitionists began a campaign by sending anti-slavery leaflets by post to the South. Jackson, as a slave owner himself, supported his own Postmaster General in refusing to use the post office to deliver such material. He believed that such material could heighten tensions between slaves and property owners. Jackson was primarily a white property owner's president. They were the only people with votes at the time. 2 states joined the Union during Jackson's presidency, Arkansas in 36 and the following year Michigan in 37. The national debt was almost zero at the end of 36. The population of the United States was about 15 million when he left office in 37. There was then 26 states in the Union at the end of his presidency. Andrew Jackson was an immensely influential figure in American politics for about 30 years, from 1815 until 1845. However, his treatment of Native Americans and people of colour cast a stain on his achievements, and he's now rarely regarded as one of the great American presidents.